So, welcome everyone. This is a short course on how to analyse poetry. It's aimed at AS level students and A level students, but it's useful for anybody who would like to learn more about poetry. And so, I hope that you find it useful. Really, basically, when we start thinking about analysing poetry, the main thing to remember is that although every poem is different, that there are many common attributes familiar to all poetry. And if you want to build an understanding of a poem, it's really useful to have a handy checklist of these general points. The ability to analyse a poem is based on sound understanding of poetic techniques, and it'll be especially useful in an examination where you're asked to write on a poem you have never seen before. So, looking at this handy checklist and thinking about the basics of poetry analysis, the first thing to look at is how the poem is constructed. And within that, there are lots and lots of points of analysis that you can look at. So, first of all, what is the subject matter? What is the poem about? And what is the meaning of the poem that the writer is trying to convey? And then you could also think about what's the form of this poem? Imagine that you've never seen it before, but you know what the forms are. So you know what different forms a poem can take, and you're looking for those qualities in this poem that you've got in front of you. So, for example, the poem could be a ballad, and a ballad you would recognise as a poem that is narrating a story in short verses. It'll have a simple quality, and it'll probably have been passed through history. So when you get familiar with ballads, you would be able to spot it. Another example is a sonnet, a 14-line poem. So you often get Shakespearean sonnets, for example. In the glossary, in the next section, I have outlined for you the main types of forms so that you can recognise these in the future. The next thing to think about is rhyme. How does the poem rhyme? There are lots of different types of rhymes. You can have perfect rhyme, general rhyme, alliteration, assonance. Take, for example, perfect rhyme. That means the last emphasized vowel and all the following vowel sounds are the same. For example, light and might. Again, in the glossary, I've gone through these in more detail so that you can understand what the different rhyme types are, or at least what the main types of rhymes are, and then you can pick them out again when you see them. I'll also look at rhyme schemes in the glossary in more detail, but basically a rhyme scheme is the way that lines that rhyme in a poem are given a letter. So if line 1, the first line of your poem, starts with A, if that line rhymes and we call it A, then the next line that rhymes with that line would also be called A. And if the line next to that is different, we'd call that B. But the next line that's like B, we also call it B. And so you might get a rhyme scheme that's A, B, A, B, for example. In the glossary, that's highlighted through an example poem so that you can see where to look out for those. The next thing is structure. Structure is the internal organisation of a poem. When discussing structure, you might comment on what the poem is about and how the lines connect, and how the poem ends. A really important thing when analysing a poem is to think about language. These points that we've touched on do also touch on language, but under the language category, you're more thinking about alliteration, metaphor, simile, imagery, and how those contribute to the poem. So, for example, a metaphor is an expression that describes a person or object by referring to something that is considered to have similar characteristics to that person or object. E.g., the city is a swamp. That's an example of a metaphor. Simile is the comparison of one thing with another, used to make a description more vivid. For example, strong as an ox. In the glossary in the next section, I've gone into more detail on that so you can have a better idea of the types of language points to spot. But again, very, very helpful if you've got a checklist of these points. These techniques that you'll see in the next section convey meaning and express the ideas and emotions behind a poem. You should keep this glossary handy when reading and analysing any poem. The poems you read will be different, but the features here will be common to many poems. For each technique you spot from the list, you should ask, how do these techniques reveal meaning, and how does the poet create effects in his or her writing?